Okay. On February 7, 1962, at 12:01 a.m., the history of the United States economy in the late 20th and early 21st century was forever changed. Hi, my name is Austin Martin, and today I will be speaking to you about the effect of the U.S.-Cuba embargo on the United States economy today. First, I will explain the history of the Cuban embargo. Second, I will talk about the current state of the Cuban embargo. And then lastly, I will talk about the effects on the economy and my personal views on the embargo. The embargo was enacted February 3, 1962 by executive order from then President John F. Kennedy in response to the escalation of Soviet-made weapons on the island. This embargo blocked all trade going to and coming from the island of Cuba in the United States. After the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1963, the embargo was then strengthened to include all travel and communication with the island of Cuba. Travel was reinstated during the Carter administration in the 1970s, but then was restricted again during the Reagan administration and has stayed roughly the same since then. Under the Obama administration, travel restrictions have been loosened, but they are still very restricting. Today, travel to Cuba is restricted to four main groups: Cuban American citizens who have family in Cuba and visit them frequently, students who are international affairs majors or are studying something that relates to Cuba and can get a State Department waiver, religious missionaries that are going on a mission trip to further religion in the communist state, or telecommunication workers and contractors going to upgrade or work on Cuba's telecommunications system. Despite all of these travel restrictions, there is one way for regular citizens to travel to Cuba through a Travel Cuba state-sponsored program. But it is very expensive and very hard to get a date that will work. Still, despite all of these restrictions, American citizens find ways to travel to the elusive island by traveling to Canada or Mexico and then flying directly into Jose Marti International Airport in Havana. If caught illegally traveling to the island through one of these other nations that allows travel to Cuba, the traveler is fined $250,000 plus a civil penalty of up to $55,000 per traveler, depending on the circumstances. Regardless of Americans traveling to the island being illegal, there still is one way for people to get on the island, and that is through the military and its base at Guantanamo Bay. The Guantanamo Bay Naval Base operates on the basis of the Platt Amendment of 1903, enacted after the Spanish-American War, which prevents United States troops from leaving the island of Cuba. According to the United States Chamber of Commerce, the effect on the Cuban embargo cost the United States economy roughly $1.2 billion per year. Now, there are two counters to this claim, which the Cuban government estimates that it is much lower at $685 million, while the Cuba Policy Foundation, a nonpartisan group based out of the United States, estimates that the embargo costs $3.6 billion annually. Despite the embargo on trade, there are three main items of supplies that can travel from the United States to Cuba. And those three are food and agricultural supplies, medical supplies, and telecommunications support. It is estimated by the U.S. Department of Agriculture that the United States exports account for 30% of Cuba's food supply per year, which makes us the largest exporter of agricultural supplies to the island in the world and makes us the sixth largest exporter to the island of Cuba. Now, it is my view that not only is the embargo against Cuba an outdated policy in our world today, but that it does in fact hurt the economy, and we should repeal it as quickly as possible. Since early 1992, after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1990, and after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the United Nations has passed 20 resolutions, one each year from 1992 up until 2011, chastising the United States for having an embargo against Cuba, citing it as a failed Cold War policy that is outdated and needs to be repealed. The same view that I have. As the only member state of the United Nations to not trade with the island, we have a few different regime changes that have happened since then. Since the embargo, there's been a regime change in Cuba. From Fidel Castro, the ruler during the embargo and up until just recently, and to his brother Raul Castro, who took over when Fidel stepped down due to medical reasons. According to a 2008 USA Today / Gallup poll, it showed that 61% of the polling population agreed that the Cuba embargo should be lifted and that trade and diplomatic relations should resume with the island, despite an 83% unfavorable vote for the Castro regime. In a separate poll conducted by the Agnes Reed Public Opinion Polling Agency, 57% of Americans called for the repealing of the Cuba embargo, despite, again, a high disapproval of the Castro regime. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union, the main reason for the embargo, Soviet stockpiles of weapons on the island that could damage the United States, is no longer apparent or a threat in our world. Cuba is listed on the U.S. State Department's list of countries that sponsor terrorism, despite that there is no solid fact that Cuba has ever supported terrorism, nor do they trade with any of our current enemies. In conclusion, I believe that the Cuba embargo must be ended for the good of the American community as well as the United States economy in these tough times.